At 17:35 local time on January 20th, 2026, this U.S. Navy P-8A Poseidon was executing a standard surveillance track at 26,000 feet over the Strait of Hormuz. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the Persian Gulf, but the mission profile remained strictly routine. After 4 hours of silent running, the threat warning receiver shattered the calm. Tehran had decided to send a physical message. 6 seconds later, an Iranian F-14 Tomcat erupted from the twilight haze at the 2 o'clock position. The vintage interceptor was pushing Mach 1.4, afterburners glowing against the darkening sky. The fighter sliced across the P-8's flight path with barely 400 feet of separation. At a combined closure rate of 1,200 miles per hour, the margin for error was non-existent. The American pilots didn't see a plane, they saw a metallic blur. The massive pressure wave from the Tomcat slammed into the Poseidon like an invisible sledgehammer. The 138,000-pound aircraft rolled violently to the left, autopilot disengaging instantly as the stick shaker activated in the cockpit. The pilots wrestled the yoke to arrest the roll, fighting against the chaotic air that was still churning from the fighter's passage. The CFM56 engine surged momentarily, their computer controls struggling to balance fuel flow as the intake air density fluctuated wildly. For the crew in the back, the floor tilted 30 degrees, sending loose equipment sliding across the deck. They stabilized at 25,500 feet, heart rate spiking, but the engagement was far from over. The tactical coordinator barely had time to reset his displays before the F-14 reappeared. This time, there was no high-speed pass. The Tomcat eased into position off their port wing, slowing to match their airspeed at 440 knots. The separation was terrifyingly intimate, 130 feet. At this distance, the margin between a diplomatic incident and a debris field is measured in milliseconds. The Iranian pilot was flying a 1970s-era airframe with aggressive confidence, drifting closer until the gap narrowed to less than 80 feet. The Americans could clearly see the pilot's helmet pivoting toward them, inspecting his prey. This was a deliberate act of intimidation, forcing the P-8 to fly a straight line. The physics of the situation were lethal. The Poseidon, essentially a militarized Boeing 737, has the inertia of a freight train. It requires seconds to initiate a turn and even longer to arrest it. The F-14, with its variable sweep wings extended for lift, could twitch away instantly. If the P-8 pilot sneezed or if a sudden gust of wind hit them, their 123-foot wingspan would sweep into the fighter's cockpit. The Iranian was banking on the Americans' professionalism to keep him alive. He was treating a 138,000-pound surveillance aircraft like a static object, seemingly unaware that he was flying inside the P-8's blind spots. The wake from his twin engines was now, washing directly over the P-8's port stabilizer, causing a constant, shuddering vibration through the airframe. It felt like driving a bus down a highway while a sports car swerved inches from your front bumper. One miscalculation, one mechanical hiccup from that aging Persian cat, and both crews would be swimming in the Gulf. The audio warnings in the P-8 cockpit shifted from a rhythmic chirp to a solid, piercing tone. The electronic warfare officer didn't flinch. On his display, a specific threat ring turned red. The Iranian pilot had just activated his AWG-9 fire control radar. This wasn't a navigational sweep anymore. The F-14 was painting the Poseidon with focused X-band energy. It's the difference between scanning a dark room with a flashlight versus pointing a laser pointer directly at someone's forehead. The Iranian pilot believed this was the ultimate power move, a digital gun to the head of the Americans. But inside the P-8, the mood wasn't panic. It was calculated opportunism. The Poseidon's AN/ALQ-240 electronic support measures suite immediately began ingesting the signal. Think of it as a frequency vacuum cleaner. The moment that radar beam touched their skin, the system started cataloging the AWG-9's pulse repetition frequency, scan logic, and modulation patterns. Data that Tehran tries desperately to keep off the airwaves was now streaming in real time via encrypted satellite link to the Office of Naval Intelligence. The Iranian pilot thought he was establishing dominance. In reality, he was voluntarily updating the US Navy's threat library. The Iranian pilot was just getting started. Unsatisfied with simply shadowing the American aircraft, he decided to turn the encounter into a private air show. The F-14 accelerated slightly, positioning itself 500 feet ahead and to the left of the Poseidon's flight path. Then, the pilot triggered the Tomcat's signature trick, the variable sweep wings. The massive lifting surfaces swept back from 20 degrees to 68 degrees, transforming the aircraft's profile from a soaring eagle to a high-speed dart. It was a dramatic display of 1970s engineering prowess. It was also a massive intelligence breach. The P-8's nose is equipped with the MX-20HD electro-optical turret, a camera system so sensitive it can read the time on a wristwatch from a cruising altitude. As the Tomcat's wings retracted, the sensor operators in the back of the P-8 weren't just watching, they were measuring. The system recorded the precise cycle time of the wing sweep mechanism, logging the seconds it took for the hydraulic screw jacks to fully actuate. They zoomed in on the wing glove vanes, the small stabilizers that extend from the fuselage, looking for uneven deployment or hydraulic leaks. This data tells US analysts exactly how well maintained the Iranian fleet actually is. A sluggish wing sweep indicates aging hydraulic fluids or worn actuators, revealing critical weaknesses in their maintenance supply chain. The F-14 then banked hard right, exposing its belly to the P-8 sensors. The pilot wanted to show off his claws. Slung under the fuselage were two massive missiles, the Fakor 90s. These are Tehran's domestic reverse-engineered versions of the American AIM-54 Phoenix. For years, Western intelligence has debated the true capabilities of these weapons. Now, they were being delivered for a high-definition close-up. The MX-20HD snapped thousands of frames per second, capturing the weld lines on the missile casings, the condition of the seeker heads, and the stenciling on the rocket motor sections. The resolution was high enough to distinguish between a live warhead and a concrete-filled training round. The sensor operators shifted the imaging spectrum to infrared. The F-14's twin TF-30 engines are notorious for running hot and being temperamental. As the fighter maneuvered, the P-8's thermal cameras mapped the heat signature across the entire airframe. They recorded the exact temperature gradient of the exhaust plumes at 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit, the heat buildup on the leading edges of the wings, and the thermal bleed from the avionics bay behind the cockpit. This is the data that feeds the targeting algorithms of the AIM-9X Sidewinder. By understanding exactly where the F-14 is hottest, US missile designers can program their seekers to ignore flares and lock onto the engine core with inescapable precision. The Iranian pilot continued his performance, executing a series of rapid aileron rolls, jerking the aircraft left and right. He likely thought he was demonstrating agility. In reality, he was stress testing his own airframe for the benefit of the Americans. The P-8 logged the deflection angles of the spoilers and the response time of the horizontal stabilizers. Every twitch of the stick provided data on the F-14's roll rate at this specific altitude and speed. The pilot was writing the manual on how to dogfight him. He was showing the Americans exactly how many degrees per second his aircraft could rotate before the aerodynamics became unstable. He was turning a potential combat adversary into a known quantity, stripping away the mystery that serves as a deterrent. He was performing for an audience that was dissecting him frame by frame. The F-14 disappeared beneath their nose for a heartbeat, then reappeared on the tactical display, climbing aggressively directly in front of the Poseidon's flight path. But instead of maintaining speed, the Iranian pilot did the unthinkable. He leveled off 1,000 feet ahead and yanked his throttles to idle, simultaneously deploying the massive air brake split between his vertical stabilizers. The fighter's airspeed collapsed from 440 knots to 240 in under 4 seconds. For the P-8 crew, it was like watching a sports car slam. Its brakes on a highway while they were driving a loaded semi-truck without ABS. The closure rate inverted instantly. They were now overtaking the fighter at 200 knots. At that speed, the math was simple and terrifying. They had less than 9 seconds before the P-8's nose radome impacted the F-14's exhaust nozzles. The P-8 pilot slammed the throttles back to the stops, but high bypass turbofan engines don't react like fighter jets. The massive CFM56s took 3 agonizing seconds just to spool down from cruise power. 10,000 pounds of rotating titanium were following their own. Lazy physics refusing to shed momentum. The P-8 was still barreling forward at 300 feet per second, eating up the safety margin. The cockpit filled with the synthetic voice of the TCAS, Traffic Collision Avoidance System. Traffic, traffic, traffic. The stick shaker activated, rattling the control columns violently. To avoid hitting the Iranian, the pilot had to pull the nose up, bleeding off speed, but the heavy aircraft was dangerously close to its own stall speed at this altitude. Their margin above the stall buffet compressed to just 15 knots. knots. 1 degree of pitch too high, and the P-8 would fall out of the sky. Here's what the Iranian pilot didn't factor into his lethal calculus. His entire deceleration profile was being recorded. The P-8 sensors logged the exact time it took for the F-14's air brake to effectively scrub speed, the bleed rate of his energy maneuvering, and the minimum controllable airspeed of the aging airframe. He was teaching American tacticians exactly how to force an F-14 into an energy trap during a dogfight. He was providing the blueprint for his own defeat while thinking he held all the leverage. Just as collision seemed inevitable, the F-14's afterburners lit. The fighter accelerated away, leaving the P-8 crew fighting to stabilize their wallowing aircraft in its wake. The tactical coordinator found the F-14 on his scope again, climbing back up directly in front, barely 350 feet ahead. This time, something new appeared on the sensor displays. The fighter's countermeasure dispensers were active. The vintage ALE-40 chaff and flare system, or its modern Iranian domestic equivalent, was spinning up for deployment. The pilot wasn't pointing away from a threat, he was positioning his tailpipes directly in the P-8's face. The Australian sensor operators didn't flinch. They adjusted their recording parameters to capture high-speed infrared signatures. The F-14 rose into position 30 feet above their flight path, engines aligned perfectly with the P-8's windscreen. At this distance, the Americans could see everything. The rectangular dispenser blocks under the beaver tail, the scorch marks from previous tests, even the hydraulic lines feeding the ejection mechanism. The geometry was deliberate. The fighter had positioned itself precisely where a flare deployment would visually overwhelm the P-8 pilots. But the Iranian pilot was about to commit his greatest professional sin. He was about to demonstrate his countermeasure system in a controlled environment. Aerial flares are the magician's smoke bomb of air combat. They are designed to seduce heat-seeking missiles away from the aircraft's engine. Every military operates some version of this technology, and every military guards the specific characteristics of their flares with paranoid intensity. The burn temperature, the spectral signature across different infrared bands, dispersion pattern, the rise time of the magnesium ignition. This data determines whether an enemy missile can be programmed to ignore the decoys and track the real target. The Iranian pilot was about to hand over the source code of his survival. The P-8's infrared sensors recalculated automatically, optimizing for the expected thermal bloom. The electronic warfare suite prepared to capture the electromagnetic pulse of the ignition squibs. Flash, flash, flash. The belly of the Tomcat erupted. 12 flares cascaded from the F-14 in a blinding barrage. Each one was a 3,000-degree Fahrenheit ball of burning magnesium, spreading into a chaotic wall of fire. The P-8 hit the visual interference in 2 seconds. The cockpit went white. But inside the sensor bay, the machines were feasting. The MX-20 HD recorded the exact spectral fingerprint of the burning magnesium. It measured how long the flare remained at peak intensity before fading. It mapped the separation rate of the decoy relative to the aircraft's wake. In 10 seconds, the Iranian pilot gave away information that Tehran's defense industry had spent decades obscuring. Future American AIM-9X missiles would now be updated with this exact data profile. Their seeker heads would be programmed to look at this specific flare signature, recognize it as Iranian Decoy Type A, and ignore it completely to continue tracking the Tomcat's engine. The pilot thought he was blinding them. He was actually ensuring that his wingman would die in the next real conflict. The F-14 peeled away, banking hard toward the Iranian coast. Its pilot probably radioed back to Bandar Abbas, reporting a successful intimidation mission. He had demonstrated resolve, forced a US Navy asset to deviate, and deployed countermeasures to show readiness. Tehran would mark this down as a victory. They would be wrong. The P-8 Poseidon turned back toward its base in the UAE, sensors retracted but hard drives full. Within 12 hours, the intelligence collected during those terrifying minutes had propagated across the entire US Fifth Fleet. The AWG-9 radar frequencies were cataloged. The structural limits of the aging Tomcats were mapped, and crucially, the specific spectral signature of Iran's defensive flares was now a known variable for American missile seekers. Tehran sent a fighter jet to deliver a message of strength. The message the United States actually received was, "Here is exactly how to shoot down our Air Force. Expensive mistake. Bye for now."